Welcome to Science at FMNH, a podcast and video series that explores the behind-the-scenes science, collections, and research at Chicago's Field Museum. We continue our discussion with Bill Parkinson to explore his research on the social dynamics of early village societies and the emergence of early states in Europe.
I run two different archaeological projects in Europe. One is in Eastern Europe, on the Great Hungarian Plain in an area called the Carpathian Basin in Central Eastern Europe, in what is modern-day Hungary. And that project is called the Kőrös Regional Archaeological Project. The Kőrös is a series of rivers that dump basically out of the foothills of Transylvania into this big flat basin, this big plain in Central Europe. And I've been working there with Hungarian colleagues and also American colleagues for about 15 years now, where we're studying a period from the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, about 7,500 years ago until about 5,000 years ago, a period called the Copper Age, when you get the emergence of these first really large, massive villages. What's interesting about Hungary is that people lived there for about 500 years, about 10 generations, maybe 15 generations, and then those sites fall apart. And people start to live in smaller social units, smaller sized villages on the landscape. The other project is a project that I'm just beginning, and that's called, we're calling it the Diros Project, which is a project in southern Greece that I run with my Greek colleagues and a collaborator from Millsaps College named Mike Galati. And we're just starting this project, and we're very excited about it. And this is exactly the same time period as my project in Hungary, only here, rather than being on a big flat plain, we've got the exact opposite environment. Here we've got coast and mountains and a very small little coastal plain. And there we've got an instance where we've got a massive cave called Alepotripa, which means foxhole cave, that is about half a kilometer from front to back, that was occupied at exactly the same time that these tell sites, these early agricultural villages, were forming in Central Europe. Here we start to get intensive occupation inside and around this large cave. And so it's this social process that people are starting to come together and living in larger and larger communities at about the same time in the same continent, but in very, very only remotely related parts of the continent. It seems to be something that's going on culturally and socially towards the end of the Neolithic that are encouraging people to live together in these larger social groups. So the real question is, why in the world people would want to live together? Right? Humans aren't designed to live together in big social groups. Lots of bad things happen. You run into problems with disease that can spread much more quickly. You run into problems with sanitation. So that's one of the questions. And then the other question is, why doesn't it work? Why, when people start to live together, why are there some dynamics that are environmental and social that encourage the persistence and the growth of those kinds of communities? And why in other places do they not last and they fall apart? So because that's what we're interested in studying, then we usually do a combination of both survey, or trying to identify sites on the landscape and trying to identify how big sites are. Then that's dependent upon, is it agricultural, is it a plowed field, because you work in a certain way in a plowed environment than you do in a not plowed environment. In Hungary, we do a lot of surface-based research and very limited, very focused excavations, because we can get a lot just by collecting the surface of a plowed field and by analyzing it with remote sensing equipment, geophysical equipment like magnetometers. We can identify buried structures underneath the surface of that field. By collecting samples to look at the chemistry of the soils, we can see how people were using different parts of that landscape. And we can do all of that before we actually put a shovel in the ground. We only run very limited excavations in Greece, but the vast majority of the work in Greece comes from the surface and information that we can find, artifacts that are on the surface, and recording walls and things like that that are sticking up above the surface. In general, we don't bring much home from archaeological projects anymore. Antiquities laws generally forbid that, and for very good reason. They tend to stay in those countries of origin. Things that we collect in Greece stay in Greece, and they probably should. Things that we collect in Hungary stay in Hungary. What we bring back are usually things that we want to do very specific research on. Either materials that we're going to bring back and run through our mass spectrometer. We'll bring ceramic samples, for example, back and run them through the mass spectrometer in the anthropology department to look at their chemical constituents that let us talk about where pots were made and match up pots with specific clay sources in the environment. The same thing with obsidian and stone tools. So when we bring things back, it's usually because we're bringing them back to do very specific studies and analyses of those materials that are lab-based that we can't easily do in the field. One of the reasons people tend to come together at certain spots on the landscape is to trade things. And so you tend to see these larger early villages form at points that are nodes within a larger network. And so the flip side of trade, anthropologically and archaeology, is warfare, right? And this is the other reason that people tend to get together. So frequently at the same places where we see lots of foreign material, lots of exotic goods coming in that are clearly being traded into this spot on the landscape, we also see fortifications. Once you have masses of people living together, it makes it easier for other big groups who are living together to attack big groups. So trade and warfare kind of flip sides of the same coin that have to do with social interaction.